Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe adjust that pillow one more time. Tonight we're stepping into the world of Victorian housemaids, not the romanticized costume drama version where everyone looks impossibly clean and has time for secret romances in the garden. No. We're talking about the actual day-to-day reality of being a young woman scrubbing other people's floors at 4 in the morning. It's going to be exhausting just hearing about it, so, perfect for drifting off. Let's begin. The Victorian era. We picture grand estates, elaborate tea services, women in massive dresses that require engineering degrees to put on. But here's the thing. For every wealthy family living in one of those beautiful townhouses or country manors, there was an entire army of servants making it all happen. And at the bottom of that army, right at the very foundation of the whole system, were the housemaids. These women, and they were almost always women, came from working class or rural families. We're talking about girls, really. Many started as young as 12 or 13, though some positions required you to be at least 14. Child labor laws were, shall we say, not really a priority in Victorian England. These girls came from families that couldn't afford to keep them at home, or from countryside villages where there simply wasn't any work. Domestic service was seen as respectable, which honestly meant a lot in an era obsessed with respectability. For many families, sending a daughter into service was almost a relief, one less mouth to feed, and if she found a position in a good household, well, that was considered quite fortunate. She'd have a roof over her head, food to eat, and maybe, just maybe, she'd learn enough skills to better herself someday. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen as often as people liked to think. The hierarchy in a large Victorian household was incredibly rigid. At the top, you had the butler and the housekeeper. These were the generals of the domestic army. Below them were various ranks of servants, each with specific duties, specific uniforms, and very specific places in the pecking order. Housemaids were divided into categories. You had the head housemaid, the upper housemaids, and then at the bottom, the scullery maid and the general housemaid. If you were just starting out, you were likely a scullery maid or a tweenie, which was short for between maid, meaning you were stuck between the kitchen and the household, doing whatever awful job nobody else wanted to do.
The thing about being a housemaid is that your entire existence revolved around being invisible. You were supposed to keep the house immaculate, but nobody was supposed to see you doing it. You were expected to vanish into the wallpaper whenever a member of the family appeared. There were actual rules about this. In many grand houses, if you encountered one of the family members in a hallway, you were supposed to turn and face the wall until they passed. Not make eye contact, not speak unless spoken to, just stand there, facing the wall like a piece of furniture that suddenly became aware of its own inadequacy. Let's talk about the daily schedule, because honestly, it's the kind of thing that makes modern complaints about early morning shifts seem almost quaint. A housemaid's day typically started around 5 or 5:30 in the morning, sometimes earlier. In the winter, this meant waking up in complete darkness in a freezing cold attic room that you probably shared with 2 or 3 other maids. Your first task of the day, before anyone in the house woke up, was to deal with the fireplaces, every single one of them. Victorian homes were heated by coal fires, which meant that every morning you had to go into each room, clean out the ashes from the previous day, lay new fires, and get them started. This was cold, dirty, miserable work. You'd be covered in coal dust and ash before the sun even came up. Of course, you had to do all of this silently, because waking the family was basically a criminal offense. After fires, you'd scrub the front steps. This was a whole thing in Victorian England. The cleanliness of your front steps was apparently a direct measure of your moral character, so every household was obsessed with having the whitest, most pristine steps on the block. Housemaids would be out there at dawn, on their knees, scrubbing stone steps with harsh lye soap and freezing water. In the winter, your hands would crack and bleed. In the summer, you'd be doing it in the heat, already exhausted before breakfast. Breakfast, by the way, was usually eaten quickly in the servants' hall, assuming you had time for it at all. You'd get basic food: bread, maybe some tea, porridge if you were lucky, nothing fancy. The good food, the roasts and pastries and elaborate meals, those were for the family upstairs. Servants ate the leftovers, if there were any, or simple, cheap staples. After breakfast, the real work began. Every room in the house needed to be cleaned. Dusting, sweeping, polishing, scrubbing. Victorians had a lot of stuff. They loved clutter. Every surface was covered with ornaments, picture frames, vases, figurines, and every single item needed to be dusted, carefully. If you broke something, the cost would be deducted from your wages, which were already almost nothing. The floors were another epic task. Carpets had to be swept or beaten. Hardwood floors had to be scrubbed on your hands and knees, then polished. Some households required you to polish the floors so thoroughly that you could see your reflection in them. Wooden furniture had to be polished with beeswax. Mirrors and windows had to be cleaned until they were spotless. Brass fixtures had to be polished until they gleamed. Everything had to be perfect. And remember, you were doing all of this while trying to remain invisible. If the family was home, you had to work around them, silently like a ghost. You'd slip into rooms when they were empty, work as quickly as possible, and vanish before anyone returned. Let's talk about the uniform, because that was its own special misery. Housemaids wore specific outfits depending on their rank and the time of day. In the morning, when you were doing the dirty work, you'd wear a plain cotton dress, usually in a drab color like brown or gray, with a rough apron over it. Your hair had to be completely covered with a cap. Later in the day, if you might be seen by the family or visitors, you'd change into a slightly nicer dress, usually black, with a white apron and a different cap. These uniforms were hot, uncomfortable, and restrictive. The dresses were long, down to your ankles with long sleeves. Even in the summer, you'd be sweating through layers of heavy fabric while scrubbing floors or hauling buckets of water. The aprons were supposed to keep you clean, but let's be honest, when you're dealing with coal fires and scrubbing floors, nothing keeps you clean. You'd be grimy and exhausted, but you still had to look presentable, because appearing dirty or disheveled in front of the family was unacceptable. Now let's talk about the bathroom situation, or more accurately, the lack thereof. In the early Victorian era, most houses didn't have indoor plumbing. Chamber pots were still the norm, and guess who had to deal with those? If you guessed the housemaids, congratulations, you understand how this system worked. Every morning, you'd have to collect the chamber pots from each bedroom, take them downstairs or outside, empty them, clean them, and return them. This was one of the most universally despised tasks, but it was absolutely part of the job. As indoor plumbing became more common in the later Victorian period, things improved slightly, but only slightly. Bathrooms still had to be cleaned, and drawing baths for the family was a major production. You'd have to carry hot water upstairs, bucket by bucket, fill the tub, make sure the temperature was right, lay out towels and soap, and then, after the family member was done, drain the tub and clean everything up. All of this for a bath that you yourself probably got to take maybe once a week if you were lucky. Personal hygiene for servants was not a priority. You worked long hours, you were constantly dirty from your work, but you had very limited resources for keeping yourself clean.
You'd wash your face and hands when you could, maybe sponge yourself down occasionally, but a proper bath was a rare luxury. This, combined with the fact that you were doing physically demanding labor in heavy clothing, meant that most housemaids were probably not feeling their freshest most of the time. The isolation was another aspect that doesn't get talked about enough. If you were a housemaid in a large household, you might be living with other servants, but you weren't really supposed to socialize much. Everyone had their place in the hierarchy, and stepping out of line was frowned upon. The upper servants, like the housekeeper or the lady's maid, wouldn't associate with lower servants like scullery maids, and you certainly weren't allowed to be friendly with the family. Your time off was extremely limited. In many households, you'd get 1 half-day off per week if you were lucky. That was it. One afternoon, maybe a Sunday afternoon when you could leave the house and do whatever you wanted. For many young women, this meant going to church, writing letters home, or maybe meeting up with other servants from nearby houses. Some girls would use their time off to visit family if they lived close enough. But for those who came from the countryside, going home was a rare event, maybe once a year. You were also expected to be available basically all the time. If the family needed something in the evening, you couldn't just say, "Sorry, I'm off duty." There was no off duty. You lived in the house, you were always on call. If a bell rang in the middle of the night because someone wanted a glass of water or an extra blanket, you got up and provided it. The wages were, unsurprisingly, terrible. A young housemaid might earn somewhere between 8 and 12 pounds a year. For context, that's less than £1 a month. Experienced housemaids might earn a bit more, maybe 15 to 20 pounds annually, but we're still talking about an incredibly small amount of money. And remember, you were working basically every waking hour, 7 days a week. The argument, of course, was that you were also getting room and board, so you didn't need much money. But the room was usually a tiny cold attic space shared with other maids, and the board was basic leftover food. You weren't exactly living in luxury. And if you wanted anything beyond the absolute basics, new shoes, a small gift for your family, maybe a ribbon or a bit of fabric, you had to save for months.
Some households allowed their maids to receive gifts or hand-me-downs clothing from the family, which was considered a generous perk. You'd get a dress that the lady of the house no longer wanted, and you were expected to be grateful for it, even though it probably didn't fit properly and wasn't suited for the kind of work you were doing. There was also the constant threat of dismissal. You could be fired for almost anything: breaking something valuable, being impudent to a family member, being seen talking to a man, becoming pregnant, being suspected of stealing, or sometimes just because the family decided they didn't like you. And if you were fired without a good reference, finding another position was nearly impossible. Your entire future depended on staying in the good graces of your employers, which meant accepting whatever treatment came your way and never, ever complaining. The power dynamic was completely one-sided. The family had all the power, you had none. If a son or male guest of the family decided to bother you, there wasn't much you could do about it. Reporting it would likely get you fired, not him reprimanded. Many young housemaids found themselves in impossible situations, and the society of the time offered them virtually no protection or support. Pregnancy outside of marriage was basically a death sentence for your career and reputation. If you became pregnant, you'd be dismissed immediately without a reference and with nowhere to go. Victorian society was harshly judgmental towards fallen women, and a housemaid who'd had a child out of wedlock had very few options. Workhouses, prostitution, or extreme poverty were often the only paths forward. The father, if he was from the family or their social circle, faced no consequences whatsoever. Let's drift over to the specific tasks that filled a housemaid's day, because the sheer variety of tedious, back-breaking work is almost impressive. You weren't just cleaning, you were maintaining an entire lifestyle for people who'd never cleaned anything themselves and had no concept of how much effort it took. Take laundry, for example. Before washing machines, doing laundry was an all-day affair, sometimes multiple days. In larger households, there might be a specific laundry maid, but in smaller homes, housemaids did it all. You'd haul water, heat it over a fire, scrub clothes by hand using harsh soap and a washboard, wring everything out, hang it to dry, then iron it using heavy flat irons that you heated on the stove.
Ironing was its own special nightmare. Those flat irons weighed several pounds each. You'd heat them until they were almost too hot to handle, then press clothes and linens with them until they cooled down, at which point you'd swap for another hot iron. You had to be careful not to scorch the fabric, but also get everything perfectly smooth. A lady's dress could take an hour or more to iron properly, with all its layers and ruffles and pleats. Table setting and meal service was another whole domain. In wealthier homes, there might be footmen or parlor maids to handle this, but in many middle-class households, the housemaid did it all. You'd set the table with the correct silverware, plates, and glasses for each course. You'd serve the food, refill glasses, clear plates between courses, and then clean up everything afterward. The Victorians loved their formal dining rules. There were specific ways to fold napkins, specific orders for silverware, specific etiquette for serving from the left or right. You had to learn all of this, and you had to execute it perfectly, while again being as invisible as possible. You weren't part of the dinner conversation. You were a silent, efficient presence, there only to facilitate the family's meal. After dinner, you'd clear the table, wash every dish, glass, and piece of silverware by hand, put everything away in its proper place, clean the dining room, and prepare everything for breakfast the next morning. By the time you finished, it might be 9 or 10 at night. You'd been working since 5 in the morning. But you still weren't done. Before bed, you'd need to check all the fires again, make sure everything was locked up, lay out anything the family might need in the morning, and prepare your own uniform for the next day. You might finally get to bed around 10 or 11 at night, only to wake up again at 5 and do it all over. Sundays were technically supposed to be a bit easier, a day of rest, but in reality, you still had most of your usual duties. You might get to attend church, which was considered important for your moral development, but church attendance was often mandatory, not optional. You'd go to the servants' service, which was separate from where the family sat, naturally. Even in the house of God, the class divisions remained firmly in place.
The concept of a vacation didn't really exist for housemaids. You might get a few days off once a year to visit family, but that was about it. The idea of taking time off just to relax or travel for pleasure would have seemed absurd. You worked. That was your life. Let's pause here and consider what this did to a person. Imagine being a young teenager sent away from your family to live in a stranger's house. You work from before dawn until late at night every single day. You're constantly exhausted. Your hands are raw from harsh soap and cold water. Your knees hurt from scrubbing floors. Your back aches from hauling coal and water. You have almost no money, almost no time to yourself, no privacy, and no real control over your own life. You're told that you should be grateful for this opportunity, that you're lucky to have a position in a respectable household, that if you work hard and behave properly, maybe someday you'll move up to a better position. Maybe you'll become a lady's maid or a housekeeper with a bit more status and slightly better pay. But for most housemaids, that never happened. They worked in the same grinding conditions for years, or until they got married, or until their health gave out. The Victorian obsession with cleanliness and order was built on the backs of these women. The gleaming floors, the dust-free parlors, the elaborate meals, the perfectly pressed linens, all of it required endless hours of invisible labor. The families living in those beautiful homes could enjoy their leisure time, their social calls, their hobbies and pursuits, because someone else was doing absolutely everything for them. And here's the thing that's almost darkly funny about it all. The Victorians loved to talk about morality and virtue and the dignity of hard work, but they also believed that some people were simply meant to serve and others were meant to be served. It wasn't questioned. It was just the natural order of things. A housemaid wasn't seen as someone trapped in an exploitative system. She was fulfilling her proper role in society. There were, of course, some households that treated their servants relatively well. Some employers were fair, kind even. They paid on time, didn't overwork their staff too severely, provided decent food and living conditions. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. And even in the best households, you were still a servant. You were still fundamentally separate and beneath the family you worked for.
The literature of the time occasionally touched on the lives of servants, but usually in a romanticized or moralistic way. The good servant was loyal, hardworking, and grateful. The bad servant was lazy, dishonest, and uppity. Real, complex human beings with their own dreams and frustrations and desires rarely made it into the popular narratives. So when we picture the Victorian era, with all its elegance and refinement, it's worth remembering that the vast majority of people living through it weren't experiencing elegance at all. They were experiencing exhaustion, monotony, and a social system that valued them only for their labor. Let's float forward into some of the specific health issues that housemaids faced, because the physical toll of this work was significant. The constant kneeling to scrub floors led to a condition literally called housemaid's knee, which was inflammation and swelling of the knee joint. It was so common among domestic servants that it became the standard name for the condition. The harsh cleaning chemicals of the era, things like lye and carbolic acid, would burn and crack the skin on your hands. Many housemaids had permanently damaged hands, covered in calluses, scars, and chemical burns. There were no rubber gloves. You just stuck your hands into whatever caustic substance you were using and dealt with it. The coal dust from tending fires led to respiratory problems. The heavy lifting, hauling buckets of water and coal up and down stairs all day, strained backs and joints. The lack of proper sleep and nutrition left immune systems weakened. Many young women developed chronic health problems that would stay with them for life. And there was almost no access to medical care. If you got sick, you were expected to keep working, unless you were literally too ill to stand. Asking for time off to rest or see a doctor was seen as shirking your duties. Some employers might call a doctor if you were seriously ill, but the cost would likely be deducted from your wages. Minor ailments, aches and pains and exhaustion, you just pushed through.
Mental health, of course, wasn't even a concept that applied to servants. If you were sad or anxious or depressed, well, that was just weakness. You needed to pull yourself together and get back to work. The isolation, the exhaustion, the lack of autonomy, all of it took a psychological toll that nobody acknowledged or cared about. The Victorian era did see some reform movements aimed at improving conditions for workers, but domestic servants were largely left out of these efforts. Factory workers eventually got some protections, limits on working hours, basic safety standards, but domestic servants worked in private homes, behind closed doors, and what happened there was considered a private matter. The law didn't reach into those spaces to protect the people working there. There were a few charitable organizations that tried to help, offering training programs or assistance finding positions, but their impact was limited. The system was too entrenched, too much a part of the social fabric. Some housemaids did manage to save enough money to eventually leave service. Maybe they got married, or opened a small shop, or found some other line of work. But many spent their entire working lives in domestic service, moving from one household to another, aging out of the more demanding positions until they ended up in workhouses or relying on charity in their old age. There was no pension, no retirement plan. When you were too old or too worn out to work anymore, you were on your own. Some long-serving housekeepers or ladies' maids might receive a small pension from grateful employers, but for the average housemaid, there was nothing. So yeah, being a Victorian housemaid was about as far from romantic as you can get. It was hard, monotonous, poorly paid, and physically destructive work done by young women who had very few other options. The pretty costumes and grand houses we see in period dramas were real, but the experience of the people making that lifestyle possible was anything but glamorous. All right, that's where we'll pause for now. Close your eyes. Imagine not having to wake up at 5 a.m. to scrub someone else's fireplace. Feel grateful for your washing machine. And we'll continue drifting through this world next time. Sleep well.
Hey, welcome back. Or, if you're still here from part 1, hey, you're still awake. That's fine. We're going to keep drifting through the world of Victorian housemaids, getting into even more detail about what this life actually looked like. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's continue. We covered the basic daily grind in part 1, but there's so much more to unpack here, because not all housemaid positions were the same, and the experience could vary wildly depending on where you ended up. Let's talk about the different types of households and what that meant for your day-to-day existence. First, you had the grand aristocratic estates. These were the massive country houses with dozens or even hundreds of rooms, sprawling grounds, and servant staffs that could number anywhere from 20 to over 100 people. If you were a housemaid in one of these places, you were part of a highly organized machine. Everything ran on strict schedules and rigid hierarchy. You'd have very specific duties, and you'd rarely, if ever, interact with the family directly. You might work in that house for years and never have a conversation with the lady or lord who owned it. In these grand houses, the servant quarters were like a completely separate world. You'd have your own hallways, your own staircases, your own dining hall. The family lived in their elegant rooms upstairs or on the main floors, and you lived in the attics or basement areas, moving through the house via back passages and service stairs. The two worlds existed side by side, but rarely touched. The advantage of working in a large household was that you were more anonymous. If you kept your head down and did your work, you could more or less blend into the background. The disadvantage was that the work was relentless and the hierarchy was oppressive. The housekeeper in a grand estate wielded enormous power over the lower servants, and if she decided she didn't like you, your life became miserable. Then you had the upper middle-class townhouses in cities like London, Manchester, or Edinburgh. These were smaller establishments, maybe keeping a staff of 5 to 10 servants. As a housemaid here, you'd probably have more varied duties. You might be doing a bit of everything: cleaning, helping with meals, answering the door, running errands. The family would be more aware of you as an individual, which could be good or bad, depending on what kind of people they were. In a smaller household, there was less anonymity. The family knew your name, noticed if you made mistakes, and had opinions about your character and work ethic. You were more likely to receive direct instructions from the mistress of the house, which meant more opportunities to accidentally offend or disappoint her. On the other hand, some families in these smaller households developed genuine, if still highly unequal, relationships with their servants. You might receive small kindnesses, extra food, hand-me-down clothes that were actually useful. Then, at the lower end, you had the modest middle-class homes that could afford maybe 1 or 2 servants. If you were the only housemaid in a household like this, congratulations, you were doing absolutely everything. You were the scullery maid, the housemaid, the parlor maid, and the kitchen helper all rolled into one. The work was brutal because there was nobody to share it with. Every single task fell on your shoulders. In these positions, you worked even more closely with the family, which removed any buffer. If the mistress was kind and reasonable, this could actually be okay. If she was demanding, petty, or cruel, you had nowhere to hide. And because these families were often on the lower rungs of the middle class themselves, they were sometimes even more obsessed with maintaining appearances and class distinctions. They'd treat their one servant more harshly than a wealthy family might treat their entire staff, because they were so anxious to prove they were above someone. The social insecurity of the middle classes was a real thing in Victorian England. These were families who'd recently acquired some wealth or were clinging to middle-class status by their fingernails, and they were desperate to demonstrate that they belonged. Having a servant was one of the key markers of middle-class respectability, so they'd scrimp and save in other areas just to afford one, and then they'd lord it over that poor girl to make themselves feel important. It's almost funny in a grim way. The wealthiest aristocrats, who'd been rich for generations, often treated servants with casual indifference. They didn't need to prove anything. But the middle-class family that was one bad investment away from poverty themselves would be the ones obsessing over whether their housemaid curtsied correctly or addressed them with proper deference. Let's talk about food in more detail, because this was a major aspect of a housemaid's life. What you ate depended heavily on which kind of household you were in and how generous your employers were. In the best situations, servants ate quite well. Large estates often had plenty of food, and the servants' meals, while simpler than what the family ate, could be substantial. You'd get meat, potatoes, bread, vegetables, tea. Not fancy, but enough to keep you going through your long days.
In less generous households, the food could be shockingly inadequate. You might get mostly bread and tea, with occasional bits of meat or cheese. Some employers believed that servants didn't need much food, or that feeding them too well would make them lazy. There are records of housemaids being given such meager rations that they were constantly hungry, which made the physical demands of the job even harder. And here's a particularly Victorian bit of cruelty. In some households, servants weren't allowed to eat leftovers from the family's meals. The food would literally be thrown away rather than given to the staff, because allowing servants to eat the same food as the family was seen as blurring class boundaries. Better to waste it than to treat your housemaid like a human being with nutritional needs. Tea was a huge part of servant life. The British were absolutely obsessed with tea, and servants drank it constantly. It was hot, it was comforting, and it gave you a little boost of energy when you were exhausted. Many housemaids started and ended their days with tea. In better households, you could drink it freely. In stingier homes, even the servants' tea was rationed, and you could get in trouble for using too much. The servants' hall, where staff ate their meals, had its own strict etiquette and hierarchy.
In large households, the upper servants, like the housekeeper and butler, ate at one end of the table, sometimes even in a separate room, while the lower servants, like housemaids and scullery maids, sat at the other end. Everyone had their place, and stepping out of it was noticed and corrected. Meals were often eaten in silence or near silence because talking too much was considered improper. The housekeeper might make announcements or give instructions, but casual conversation was discouraged. So even this small break in your day wasn't particularly relaxing. You'd sit there, exhausted, eating your bread and drinking your tea in silence, surrounded by the other servants, but still essentially alone. Let's drift over to the subject of relationships between servants, because the dynamics were complicated. You'd think that people in the same situation would band together, form friendships, support each other, and sometimes that happened. There are lovely accounts of housemaids who became close friends, who looked out for each other, who made the work bearable through small acts of kindness and solidarity.
But the rigid hierarchy made genuine friendship difficult. A lady's maid, who was upper servant, wasn't supposed to be friends with a scullery maid. They existed in different social strata even within the servant world. The lady's maid had her own room, wore better clothes, ate better food, and was treated with more respect. The scullery maid was covered in grease and coal dust, slept in the worst room, and was at everyone's beck and call. Crossing those boundaries was discouraged. The system functioned by keeping everyone in their place, and that applied within the servant hierarchy just as much between servants and employers. Upper servants often treated lower servants with the same disdain that the family showed to all servants. It was a way of clinging to what little status they had. That said, when friendships did form, they could be genuinely important. Your fellow housemaid might be the only person in the world who understood what you were going through. You'd share a room, work side by side, steal moments of conversation when you could. Some of these friendships lasted for years, even after the women left service. Romance was complicated. Servants weren't generally allowed to have followers, which was the Victorian term for boyfriends. If you were caught with a man, you could be dismissed immediately. The assumption was that a housemaid with a romantic life was distracted, unreliable, and probably morally questionable. Your entire existence was supposed to be devoted to your work. Of course, people being people, romances happened anyway. You might meet someone on your afternoon off, or develop feelings for a servant from another household, or even for someone in your own household if it was large enough. These relationships had to be conducted in complete secrecy. Snatched moments of conversation, maybe letters passed back and forth. Getting caught meant losing your job, so the risk was enormous. And then there was the issue of male servants or male members of the household. In larger estates, you'd have footmen, valets, grooms, gardeners. These men existed in the same servant world, but interactions between male and female servants were carefully monitored. The concern always was about impropriety. A housemaid who was too friendly with a footman was immediately suspect.
Male members of the family, or their guests, were a different kind of danger. A young housemaid, especially a pretty one, was vulnerable. She might be subjected to unwanted attention, inappropriate comments, or worse. And she had virtually no recourse. If she complained, she'd likely be accused of encouraging it, or of lying, or of being hysterical. She'd be the one dismissed, not the man who'd bothered her. Victorian society had very firm ideas about female virtue, but those ideas conveniently evaporated when it came to protecting working-class women from upper-class men. A gentleman's reputation was worth protecting, a housemaid's was not. So if something happened, the fault was always placed on her, regardless of the actual circumstances. Some young women who became pregnant while in service were victims of assault or coercion by employers or their sons, but Victorian morality didn't care about that. She was ruined, fallen, and that was that. She'd be thrown out without a reference, and her options from that point were grim. Some ended up in workhouses. Some turned to prostitution because there was literally no other way to survive. Some managed to find work in factories or as street sellers, scraping by in extreme poverty. There were charitable organizations that tried to help these women, homes for unwed mothers and such, but they were few and far between, and they usually came with heavy doses of moral judgment and religious indoctrination. You could receive help, but you'd have to sit through endless lectures about your sins and failures. The baby would typically be taken away for adoption, and you'd be sent out to try to rebuild a life with no money, no references, and a permanent stain on your reputation. Meanwhile, the man involved faced no consequences at all. He'd go on with his life, marry someone of his own class, and probably never think about the housemaid whose life he'd destroyed. Let's talk about regional differences, because the experience of being a housemaid in rural Yorkshire was different from being one in London or Edinburgh. In the countryside, especially in more remote areas, servants were often local girls from the surrounding villages and farms. You might be working in the big house just a few miles from where you grew up. This meant you could potentially visit family more easily, but it also meant less privacy. Everyone knew everyone, and gossip traveled fast.
Rural households tended to be a bit less formal in some ways. The grand estates still maintained strict hierarchies, but smaller country manners might be more relaxed. The work was still hard, but the pace might be slightly less frenetic than in a fashionable London townhouse where there were constant social events and visitors. In cities, you were more anonymous, which had advantages and disadvantages. You were far from home, often in a completely unfamiliar place. London, in particular, was overwhelming for young girls who'd never been to a city before. It was loud, crowded, dirty, and dangerous. But it also offered more opportunities. There were more households, more positions, and if you lost one job, you might find another more easily than in a rural area where options were limited. Scottish households had some different traditions and expectations compared to English ones. The food was different. The household routines might vary slightly. The accents and local customs took some getting used to. Irish housemaids often came to England seeking work, and they faced additional prejudice. Anti-Irish sentiment was strong in Victorian England, and Irish servants were often paid less and treated worse than their English counterparts. Welsh housemaids faced similar biases, though perhaps less intensely. The assumption was always that English servants were somehow superior, more refined, more trustworthy. This, of course, was complete nonsense, but it affected hiring practices and treatment. Let's float over to the question of education and training. Most housemaids had very little formal education. If you were lucky, you'd had a few years of basic schooling, enough to read and write at a simple level. Many were functionally illiterate or could barely write their own names. Education wasn't seen as important for girls who were going into service. You needed to know how to clean, cook, and obey orders, not read books. Some employers preferred uneducated servants because they were easier to control. A housemaid who could read might start getting ideas above her station, might start thinking she deserved better treatment, might become dissatisfied with her lot. Better to keep them ignorant and compliant. There were a few training programs in schools for domestic servants that opened in the later Victorian period, trying to professionalize service and improve standards. These programs taught things like proper cleaning techniques, laundry methods, cooking basics, and household management. The idea was to create a better class of servant, one who could meet the exacting standards of employers. But these programs were limited and not widely accessible. Most housemaids learned on the job, through trial and error, or from other servants. You'd start in the lowest position, watch what the more experienced maids did, and try to copy them. If you made mistakes, you'd be corrected, sometimes harshly. You learned quickly because the alternative was losing your job. The skills you developed were valuable in a way. A good housemaid knew how to do an enormous range of tasks. She could clean anything, cook basic meals, do laundry, sew, iron, polish, organize a household. These were marketable skills, and experienced housemaids could command slightly better wages. But these skills didn't necessarily translate to opportunities outside of service. It's not like you could take your expertise in scrubbing floors and parlay it into a business career. The skills kept you employed as a servant, which was useful for survival, but didn't offer a path out of that life. Some housemaids did learn enough to eventually become housekeepers, which was a significant step up. A housekeeper in a large household was a person of real authority. She managed the female servants, controlled the household budget for supplies, and interfaced directly with the mistress of the house. Housekeepers were paid much better, had their own private rooms, and were treated with respect by the other servants. But becoming a housekeeper required years of experience and impeccable reputation, and usually some luck. You had to be in the right place when a position opened up, and you had to be chosen over other candidates. Many housemaids never made it that far. They spent their entire careers as general housemaids or parlor-maids, never advancing.
The alternative path was to become a lady's maid, which was a completely different kind of position. A lady's maid was a personal servant to the lady of the house or her daughters. You'd help with dressing, do hair, maintain the wardrobe, pack for trips, and generally be a constant companion. It was a privileged position in many ways. You'd wear better clothes, have access to cast-off dresses and accessories, travel with the family, and be privy to intimate family matters. But it also required different skills. You needed to be good with hair and fashion, discreet, tactful, and able to handle delicate social situations. You'd be much more visible to the family and their social circle. A lady's maid was almost a status symbol herself. A fashionable, well-turned-out lady's maid reflected well on her employer. These positions usually went to women who were a bit older, more refined and well-trained. A girl starting out as a scullery maid was unlikely to ever become a lady's maid. The paths were different, and once you started on one, it was hard to switch to the other. Let's talk about the little moments of humanity that occasionally broke through the grimness, because it wasn't all misery all the time. There were moments of kindness, of connection, of small joys. Some employers genuinely cared about their servants' well-being. They'd make sure the servants' quarters were reasonably comfortable, provide good food, allow adequate time off, and treat their staff with basic respect and courtesy. These households were rare, but they existed. Servants who found positions in such places would stay for years, even decades, developing something like loyalty or affection for the family. There were employers who paid for medical care when servants were ill, who gave generous Christmas bonuses, who remembered servants' birthdays or family situations. Small gestures, maybe, but they meant a lot to women whose lives were otherwise quite bleak.
And there were moments of camaraderie among servants. In the evening, after the work was finally done, servants might gather in the servants' hall or their rooms and talk, share stories, maybe sing songs or play cards if the household allowed it. These stolen moments of rest and socialization were precious. Holidays could sometimes be opportunities for slight relaxation. Christmas, in particular, was a time when some employers gave their servants small gifts or extra food. There might be a servant's Christmas party with a better meal than usual, and maybe an afternoon of relative leisure. Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, was traditionally when servants received their Christmas boxes, small gifts or money from the family. Of course, holidays also meant extra work because the family was entertaining and wanted everything to be perfect. But there was usually at least some acknowledgement that it was a special time, and servants might get small treats or slightly less harsh treatment. Some housemaids found moments of beauty or peace in their work. If you worked in a house with a garden, you might get to see it in bloom. If your duties included opening curtains in the morning, you might catch a sunrise. If you polished silver or brass, there was a kind of satisfaction in seeing it gleam. These tiny moments weren't much, but when your life is hard, you take comfort where you can find it. Letter writing was important for many housemaids. If you could write, you'd send letters home to your family, keeping them updated on your life and asking about theirs. Receiving a letter back was a highlight. It was a connection to the world outside the household, a reminder that you were part of a family, that someone cared about you. Some housemaids saved their meager wages for years with specific goals in mind. Maybe they wanted to help a younger sibling, or save enough to open a small shop someday, or build a dowry in hopes of marrying. Having a goal, even a distant one, gave some purpose to the endless drudgery. Reading, for those who could, was an escape. Some servants would get their hands on books or newspapers, borrowed or given as cast-offs, and read in whatever spare moments they could find. The family might have a library full of books that you weren't allowed to touch, but occasionally a kind employer would give a servant access to old books or periodicals. For a young woman trapped in a life of physical labor, reading could be a window into other worlds, other possibilities. Religious faith was important to many servants. Going to church on Sunday wasn't just an obligation, it was also a source of comfort and community. The church taught that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, which was a message that resonated with people whose present circumstances were pretty terrible. Whether or not you found that theologically convincing, the church was also a place where you might meet other servants, sing hymns, and feel part of something larger than yourself. Some churches and religious organizations did try to help servants, offering literacy classes, lending libraries, or social events. These efforts were limited and often came with religious strings attached, but they were something. Now let's get into the economics of service from the employer's perspective, because understanding why the system worked the way it did requires looking at the incentives. For middle and upper-class Victorians, having servants was economically rational. Labor was cheap, and the cost of keeping a housemaid was far less than the value of the work she did. It was an incredibly good deal for the employer. And because there was always a surplus of young women desperate for work, employers could be as demanding and stingy as they wanted. If a housemaid quit or was fired, there were 10 more girls waiting for the position. The power dynamic was completely tilted in favor of the employer.
For the working-class families sending their daughters into service, it was often the best of bad options. The girl would have room and board, which meant one less person to feed at home. She might be able to send money back to her family, even just £1 or £2 a year helped. And there was always the hope that she'd find a good position, be treated well, maybe save enough money to improve her circumstances. The whole system was built on a foundation of class inequality that was seen as natural and unchangeable. The idea that maybe housemaids deserved better wages, shorter hours, or more rights would have struck most Victorians as absurd or even dangerous. The lower classes existed to serve the upper classes. That's just how society worked. There were some voices calling for reform even in the Victorian era. Social reformers, some religious organizations, and a few progressive thinkers argued that domestic servants deserved better treatment and legal protections. But these voices were marginal, and they had very little impact on actual policy. The problem was that domestic service happened in private homes. It wasn't like factory work, which was public and could be regulated. What happened between an employer and a servant in the privacy of a household was considered a private matter. The government wasn't going to step in and tell people how to treat their own servants. And servants themselves had almost no power to organize or advocate for better conditions. They were scattered across thousands of individual households. They had no time off to organize, and any servant who tried to stir up trouble would be immediately dismissed and blacklisted. The few attempts at creating servant unions or associations went nowhere. So the system persisted, mostly unchanged for decades. It only really started to shift in the early 20th century when new economic opportunities for women opened up and fewer young women were willing to go into service. World War I was a major turning point as women took on factory work and office work to support the war effort and discovered that they could earn more money with better hours and more freedom than they ever had in domestic service.
But we're still in the Victorian era, where service was still seen as a respectable and necessary part of life. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because they often did. If you became sick or injured and couldn't work, your situation became precarious very quickly. Some employers would keep you on and care for you, at least for a while. Others would dismiss you immediately. You were only valuable as long as you could work. Once you became a liability, you were expendable. Long-term illness or disability meant you couldn't work as a servant anymore, and you had no safety net. If you had family who could take you in, you might survive. If not, you were looking at the workhouse or charity. Victorian society had no social services in the modern sense. There was no unemployment insurance, no disability benefits, no government support. You relied on charity, family, or ended up in institutions that were deliberately made harsh to discourage people from using them. The workhouse was the dreaded last resort. These were institutions where the destitute could go for shelter and food, but the conditions were intentionally terrible. The idea was to make the workhouse so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would go there, and everyone else would be motivated to avoid poverty. You'd be separated from family members, forced to do hard labor, fed minimal rations, and treated as a moral failure. Former servants made up a significant portion of workhouse populations. Women who'd worked their whole lives for minimal pay, who'd worn out their bodies in service to others, ended up in workhouses in their old age because they had nothing saved and no one to care for them. It's remarkably cruel when you think about it. You could work hard your entire life, be obedient and diligent, and do everything you were supposed to do, and still end up destitute and dependent on the harshest form of public charity. The system didn't reward virtue or hard work. It rewarded being born into the right class. Some servants did manage to avoid this fate. If you were very careful with money, very lucky, and managed to work for many years without major illness or catastrophe, you might save enough to have a small cushion for old age. Some married and relied on a husband's income, though that came with its own risks. Some had children who could support them later in life. But the reality was that for many servants, the future was uncertain and often bleak. You lived year to year, hoping nothing went wrong because you had no buffer. One stroke of bad luck, one illness, one unjust dismissal, and your entire life could fall apart. Let's drift over to the subject of mental and emotional health, because the psychological toll of service was significant, even though nobody talked about it in those terms. The isolation, the exhaustion, the powerlessness, the constant deference and self-erasure required, all of it was damaging. You had to suppress your own personality, your own desires, your own needs. You existed to serve others. Your opinions didn't matter. Your feelings didn't matter. You were supposed to be perpetually cheerful and willing, no matter how you actually felt. If you were sad or angry or frustrated, you couldn't show it. Displaying emotion was considered inappropriate and could get you dismissed for being difficult. The loneliness was profound. You were surrounded by people, but fundamentally alone. You couldn't be fully yourself with the family because of the class barrier. You couldn't always be yourself with other servants because of the hierarchy and competition. Your family was far away. Your time off was minimal. Many servants went months or years with no real emotional connection or intimacy. Some developed depression, though it wouldn't have been called that at the time. They'd be seen as melancholy or weak-spirited. Some became numb, going through the motions of their work without feeling much of anything. Some clung to religion or fantasy or hope as a way to cope with the bleakness of their daily reality.
And some broke under the strain. There are records of servants who had what we'd call mental breakdowns, who stopped functioning or became erratic or violent. They'd be dismissed as mad or hysterical, sent away, possibly institutionalized. Mental illness wasn't understood or treated compassionately. It was seen as a personal failing, possibly a moral one. Suicide was not uncommon among domestic servants. Young women who saw no way out of their circumstances, who'd experienced trauma or found themselves pregnant or been dismissed without references, sometimes chose death over the alternatives available to them. Victorian newspapers occasionally reported on such cases, usually in a tone of moral disapproval rather than sympathy. The Victorian emphasis on keeping up appearances meant that everyone was supposed to pretend everything was fine. The family pretended they were kind and benevolent employers. The servants pretended they were grateful and content. Everyone maintained the fiction that the system worked well for everyone involved. Admitting that it was actually quite harmful would have required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about class and exploitation. Let's talk about specific household tasks in even more detail, because the sheer variety and complexity of what housemaids had to know is actually kind of impressive. Take cleaning a drawing room, for instance. This wasn't just dusting and sweeping. You had to know the proper way to clean different materials and surfaces. Wooden furniture required different treatment than upholstered pieces. You'd use beeswax on wood, applying it carefully and buffing it to a shine. Upholstery had to be brushed or beaten to remove dust, and stains had to be treated with specific solutions. Gilded frames and decorative objects required gentle dusting with soft cloths to avoid damaging the finish. Mirrors and windows were cleaned with vinegar solutions or special cleaning preparations, polished with newspaper or soft cloths until they were absolutely spotless. Brass and silver items had to be polished regularly with specific polishes, then buffed until they gleamed. Different metals required different treatments.
Carpets and rugs had to be swept with specific techniques to avoid raising too much dust. In spring, they'd be taken outside, hung over lines, and beaten with carpet beaters to remove embedded dirt. This was exhausting work, whacking away at heavy carpets until your arms ached. Floors were their own ordeal. Hardwood had to be swept, scrubbed, and polished. You'd be on your hands and knees, applying polish and buffing it in, section by section, until the entire floor gleamed. Some households wanted floors so polished you could literally see your face in them, which required hours of work. Marble floors and surfaces required different cleaning methods. Stone steps had to be scrubbed with specific brushes and solutions. Tile had to be cleaned and the grout kept white. Every surface had its own requirements, and you were expected to know all of them. The fireplace cleaning process was particularly miserable. You'd start by scooping out all the ash and cinders from the previous day's fire, trying not to create too much dust. Then you'd clean the grate, polish it if it was a nicer room, and lay a new fire. Laying a fire properly was a skill. You had to arrange the kindling and coal in such a way that it would light easily and burn efficiently. In the winter, you'd be dealing with fireplaces in every room multiple times a day, adding coal when fires burned low, making sure they didn't go out, cleaning up ash that fell on hearths. Your hands would be constantly black with coal dust. Your clothes would be grimy, and you'd be breathing in smoke and particles all day. Laundry, as we mentioned, was a multi-day ordeal. But let's get into the specifics. You'd start by sorting the laundry by type and color. Whites separate from colors, delicate fabrics separate from sturdy ones. Then you'd fill large tubs or coppers with water, which you had to haul and heat. The heating process alone took hours. You'd add soap, often harsh, lye-based soap that would burn your skin. Then you'd scrub each item on a washboard, working the fabric against the ridged surface to force out the dirt. For heavily soiled items, you'd have to scrub for ages. Your knuckles would get scraped raw on the washboard. Your hands would crack from the soap and hot water. After washing, items had to be rinsed, often multiple times to get all the soap out. Then you'd wring them out by hand, twisting the fabric to squeeze out as much water as possible. Wringing out heavy items like sheets or tablecloths was hard physical work. Your arms and legs would ache. Then everything had to be hung to dry, either outside on clotheslines or inside in drying rooms. You had to make sure items were hung properly so they'd dry evenly and without wrinkles. In the winter, drying could take days, and the damp laundry hanging everywhere made the servants' areas cold and clammy. Once dry, the ironing began. You'd heat multiple flat irons on the stove, testing them to make sure they were hot enough, but not so hot they'd scorch the fabric. Then you'd iron each item, pressing out every wrinkle, making sure collars and cuffs were crisp, pleats were sharp, and everything looked perfect. For a lady's dress, this could take well over an hour. All those layers, ruffles, trims, and decorative elements had to be carefully pressed. Men's shirts had to have perfectly smooth fronts and sharp collar points. Table linens had to be pristinely smooth.
The sheer volume of ironing in a household could take days to complete. And then you'd start the whole process over again, because there was always more laundry. It never stopped.
Cooking, if you were involved in it, was done on coal or wood stoves that were difficult to regulate. You couldn't just set a temperature. You had to learn how to manage the fire to create the right amount of heat for different tasks. Too hot and things burned. Too cool and they didn't cook properly. It took skill and experience. Baking bread, which many households did daily, required knowledge of how to make and proof dough, how to tell when the oven was the right temperature, how long to bake for the right result. Roasting meat required knowing how to prepare it, how to baste it, how to time it so it was done when the family wanted to eat. Making sauces, preparing vegetables, creating the elaborate desserts and pastries that Victorians loved, all of this required real culinary knowledge. And if you were in a household without a dedicated cook, all of this fell on the general housemaid on top of all her other duties. Preserving food was another whole skill set. Making jams and jellies, pickling vegetables, curing meat. All of this happened in Victorian households, especially in the autumn when produce was plentiful. It was hot, sticky work, standing over boiling pots of fruit or vegetables, sterilizing jars, filling and sealing them. Sewing and mending was an ongoing task. The family's clothes needed buttons reattached, hems repaired, tears mended. Household linens needed mending. Some housemaids were also expected to do more complex sewing, altering garments or creating simple items. Your own clothes required constant mending because you wore them hard and couldn't afford to replace them often. You'd patch and darn and make do, keeping your limited wardrobe functional for as long as possible. All of these tasks required knowledge, skill, and physical stamina. A competent housemaid had to be a cleaner, laundress, cook, seamstress, and more. You were essentially running all the practical aspects of a household, creating an environment of comfort and elegance for people who never had to think about how it all happened. And you did it all for a few pounds a year and a cold attic room. It's exhausting just describing it. Imagine actually living it, day after day, year after year, the sheer relentlessness of it, the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same as today, and next week would be the same as this week, and next year would bring no change or improvement. Some women adapted, found ways to cope, made peace with their circumstances. Others quietly despaired, going through the motions because there was no alternative. And a few managed to find ways out through marriage or savings or sheer determination, building different lives for themselves. But for the majority, service was their life. It defined their days, shaped their bodies, determined their futures. They were the invisible foundation on which Victorian prosperity and elegance rested. All right, we're going to pause here. Let your mind drift. Think about all the modern conveniences you have: washing machines, dishwashers, central heating, indoor plumbing, running water, electric lights, all the things that make life easier, that would have seemed like impossible magic to a Victorian housemaid. Feel grateful for them. Sleep well.
Welcome back. Or, if you've been here the whole time,
Hey, still going strong? That's fine. We're continuing our deep dive into the world of Victorian housemaids, and there's still so much ground to cover. So get settled, adjust your blankets, and let's keep drifting through this world of endless labor and rigid social hierarchies. We've talked a lot about the work itself, the daily grind, the physical toll, but let's get into the social and cultural aspects of service. Because being a housemaid wasn't just a job, it was an identity, a social position, a way of being in the world that shaped how others saw you and how you saw yourself. In Victorian society, servants occupied this strange liminal space. They weren't quite invisible, but they also weren't quite fully human in the eyes of the people they worked for. They were there, certainly. You saw them, spoke to them, relied on them completely, but you didn't think of them as having the same depth of feeling, the same complexity of inner life as people of your own class. This mindset is really evident in Victorian literature and correspondence. People would write letters or diary entries discussing intimate personal matters while servants were right there in the room, because it didn't occur to them that the servant might be listening or might have opinions about what was being said. The servant was furniture, background, not a real person whose presence mattered. Employers would discuss family secrets, financial problems, marital disputes, all sorts of private matters right in front of their housemaids. Sometimes they'd even ask the housemaid to do things related to these secrets, carry messages, dispose of evidence of affairs, help cover up scandals. The servant was expected to be absolutely discreet, to never speak of what she saw or heard, to take these secrets to her grave. And most did, because the alternative was dismissal and ruin. But it must have been strange being privy to the most intimate details of a family's life while being treated as if you barely existed. You knew everything about these people. You knew what they ate, when they slept, what they fought about, who was having affairs, which children were favored, what the family's financial situation actually was. You had more knowledge about the household than anyone outside it, but you could never speak of it.
Some housemaids kept diaries, and the ones that survive give us fascinating glimpses into this dual consciousness. They wrote about their employers with a mix of deference and sharp observation, recording details of family dynamics with an outsider's clarity. These women weren't fooled by the public facades their employers maintained. They saw everything. The class consciousness of Victorian Britain was absolutely rigid. Everyone had their place, and stepping out of it was considered offensive and dangerous. A housemaid who tried to act above her station, who forgot her place, was seen as a threat to the social order itself. The whole system depended on everyone accepting their role and staying in it. This played out in countless small ways. The language you used, the way you addressed people, the clothes you wore, the food you ate, where you walked, even how you stood or sat. Everything communicated class position, and everything was regulated. A housemaid would never address a family member by their first name, always by title. Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Right away, Miss Elizabeth. You'd curtsy when entering a room or receiving instructions. You'd keep your eyes lowered, your voice quiet, your demeanor humble. Any hint of impertinence or independence was grounds for discipline or dismissal. And yet there was this weird contradiction. The same employers who treated their servants as barely human would sometimes show moments of paternalistic affection. They'd give gifts at Christmas, inquire about a sick parent, allow a housemaid to attend a sister's wedding. These gestures were meant to demonstrate their own benevolence and kindness, and servants were expected to be deeply grateful for them. But these moments of kindness didn't change the fundamental power dynamic.
you were still completely at their mercy. They could destroy your life on a whim, and you had no recourse. So when the mistress gave you a hand-me-down shawl or let you have an extra afternoon off, you expressed profound gratitude, because that's what was expected, and because you never knew when you might need their goodwill. Let's talk about servants and children of the household, because this relationship was complicated. If there were young children in the family, you'd see them constantly. You might help the nursemaid with bathing or dressing them. You'd clean their rooms. You'd encounter them throughout the house. In households without a dedicated nursemaid, the housemaid might be directly responsible for childcare on top of all her other duties. Young children, not yet fully indoctrinated into class consciousness, sometimes formed attachments to servants. A little girl might follow the housemaid around, chattering to her, trying to help with tasks. A young boy might prefer the cook's company to his own parents. These relationships could be quite sweet, actually. The child got attention and warmth. The servant got a brief respite from being treated as non-human. But as the children grew older, they'd be taught to maintain proper distance. By the time they were teenagers, they'd learn to treat servants with the same casual dismissiveness as their parents. That little girl who used to chat with you in the kitchen now swept past you in the hallway without acknowledgement. It was a loss, in a way, watching these children you'd cared for learn to see you as lesser. Sometimes the relationship persisted despite this, especially between female servants and the daughters of the house. A girl might maintain a fondness for a particular maid, might seek her out for conversation or advice. But it had to be done discreetly, because being too familiar with servants was considered inappropriate for a young lady. Sons of the house posed a different problem. As they reached adolescence and young adulthood, some developed an unfortunate sense of entitlement toward female servants. The housemaid was there, she was lower class, she was powerless. For some young men, that made her a target. They'd make inappropriate comments, corner her in hallways, or worse. Again, the servant had no real protection. If she complained, she'd likely be accused of encouraging attention or trying to trap a young gentleman into a scandal. Better to avoid being alone with him if possible, to deflect advances as gently as you could without giving offense, and to hope he'd lose interest or get distracted by someone else. The daughters of the house sometimes developed complicated feelings about servants, especially as they got older and started to understand the system they were part of. Some felt uncomfortable with the power dynamic, felt guilty about being waited on, and tried to be kind to servants as a way of assuaging that guilt. Others accepted it as natural and treated servants with casual cruelty or indifference. And some developed genuine relationships with their ladies' maids, the servants who were closest to them. A lady's maid was a confidant, present during the most intimate moments of dressing, bathing, preparing for social events. She'd hear all the gossip, all the worries about beaux and marriages and social standing. Some mistresses treated their ladies' maids almost like friends, though the power imbalance meant it could never be a true friendship. Let's drift over to what happened during social events, because this is when the household went into overdrive. If the family was hosting a dinner party, a ball, a garden party, any kind of social event, the servants' workload multiplied exponentially. Days before the event, you'd be cleaning even more intensively than usual. Every surface had to be perfect, every room spotless. Silver had to be polished until it gleamed. The best china and glassware had to be washed and carefully arranged. Flowers had to be arranged in every room. Fireplaces had to be immaculate.
The day of the event was chaos. The kitchen would be in full production mode, creating elaborate multi-course meals. Housemaids would be running everywhere, making sure everything was perfect, that nothing was out of place. You'd be in your best uniform, the black dress and clean white apron, looking as presentable as possible because you'd be seen. During the event itself, you'd be serving food and drinks, clearing plates, managing the flow of the evening. You had to be quick and efficient, but also completely unobtrusive. Move silently, anticipate needs before they were spoken, never draw your attention to yourself. If something went wrong, a spill, a dropped plate, you had to handle it instantly and invisibly.
For servants, these events were exhausting. You'd be on your feet for hours, constantly moving, constantly alert. And after the guests finally left and the family went to bed, you still had to clean up everything, washing mountains of dishes and glassware, putting away the good china, cleaning the dining room and drawing room, dealing with spills and stains on carpets and upholstery. You might not get to bed until 2 or 3 in the morning, and you'd still have to be up at 5 for your regular duties. The family would sleep late after their party, but you wouldn't. The work didn't stop. Some grand houses had regular social seasons, hosting events constantly. If you worked in one of these households, you'd be in a perpetual state of preparation and recovery from social events. It was glamorous for the family and their guests. For the servants, it was just more work. Interestingly, these events were sometimes opportunities for servants to socialize with servants from other households. If the guests brought their own ladies' maids or valets, they'd end up in the servants' quarters, and servants would exchange news and gossip. These were rare chances to hear about life in other households, to learn who was hiring, who was a good employer, what wages were being offered elsewhere. The servants' network was actually quite robust in cities and wealthy areas. Information traveled. If you were a terrible employer who mistreated staff, word got around. Not that it necessarily stopped you from finding servants because people were desperate for work, but the better servants, the experienced ones with options, would avoid you. Similarly, if a servant had a bad reputation, that information circulated too. A housemaid known to be lazy, dishonest, or difficult would have trouble finding good positions. The reference system was everything, and a bad reference or lack of one could follow you for years.
Let's talk about the changing seasons and how they affected a housemaid's work. The Victorian household operated on seasonal rhythms, and each season brought different tasks and challenges. Spring meant spring cleaning, which was a massive undertaking. This was when you do all the deep cleaning that didn't happen regularly. Every room would be thoroughly cleaned, one by one. Furniture would be moved, carpets taken up and beaten, curtains taken down and washed. Every surface scrubbed. You'd be cleaning things that hadn't been touched in a year. Windows would be washed inside and out. Walls might be washed or repainted. Closets and storage areas would be emptied, cleaned, and reorganized. It was weeks of intensive work, turning the entire house upside down and putting it back together again. Spring cleaning was absolutely brutal. You'd be filthy, exhausted, working even longer hours than usual. But there was also something almost satisfying about it, the thoroughness of it, the visible transformation of spaces from winter grimy to spring fresh. Summer brought different challenges. If the family went away to the countryside or the seaside for the summer, as many wealthy families did, some servants would go with them, while others stayed behind to maintain the townhouse. Going with the family meant travel, which could be interesting, but also meant working in an unfamiliar setting, often with less help and fewer resources. Staying behind meant the house was quieter. The family wasn't there demanding constant attention, but you still had to keep everything clean and maintained. And you'd be doing it with a reduced staff, since some servants traveled with the family. The workload didn't decrease as much as you hope.
Summer was also hot, and remember, you're wearing long dresses with long sleeves and multiple layers. Working in a kitchen or laundry in the summer heat was miserable. You'd be drenched in sweat, barely able to breathe in the humid air. Houses weren't air-conditioned, obviously. If you were lucky, you could open windows, but that meant letting in dust and insects. Autumn meant preparing for winter. Heavier curtains would be hung, summer clothes would be cleaned and stored, winter wardrobes brought out and prepared. If the family had been away, there would be a flurry of activity getting the house ready for their return. Preserving the autumn harvest, making jams and pickles, all of that happened in the fall. Winter was cold, bitterly, miserably cold. The family's rooms would be kept warm with coal fires, but the servants' areas were freezing. You'd wake up in an attic room where you could see your breath, wash with cold water because there was no heating in the servants' bathrooms, and start your day by lighting fires for the family. Your hands would crack and bleed from the cold and from constantly being in and out of water. Chilblains, painful inflammations caused by exposure to cold, were common among servants. Your feet would be numb in your thin shoes. You'd layer on whatever clothes you had, trying to stay warm while still being able to move and work. Winter also meant shorter days, which meant you were doing more of your work in the dark. Lighting was limited. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, and servants' areas weren't well lit. You'd be straining your eyes, trying to do delicate work in dim, flickering light. And yet winter had one small mercy. The family was usually less active socially. The London social season was in spring and summer. In winter, there were fewer balls and parties, fewer guests. The household might be a bit quieter, the pace slightly less frantic. It wasn't much, but when your life is hard, you appreciate small mercies.
Let's talk about aging as a servant, because this is where the system's cruelty really becomes clear. When you were young, in your teens and 20s, you could handle the physical demands. You could work 16-hour days, scrub floors, haul water, survive on minimal sleep. Your body could take it. But as you got older, into your 30s and 40s, the work became harder. Your knees hurt more from all those years of kneeling. Your back ached from the lifting and carrying. Your hands were damaged from decades of harsh chemicals and hard work. You got tired more easily. And the problem was, the work didn't get easier. You were still expected to do everything you'd always done at the same pace, to the same standards. If you slowed down, if your work quality declined, you'd be let go and replaced with a younger woman who could work harder. Some servants who'd been in the same household for many years might be kept on even as they aged, their workload adjusted to their abilities. A housekeeper or lady's maid who'd served the family faithfully for decades might be pensioned off in old age, given a small annual sum to live on. This was the best-case scenario, and it was rare. More commonly, aging servants found themselves dismissed or forced to take lower-paying positions that required less physical labor. A woman who'd been housemaid might end up as a charwoman, doing rough cleaning work by the day for various clients. This paid even less and offered no security, but if your body couldn't handle full-time service anymore, it might be your only option. Some older servants ended up as landladies, running boarding houses or lodging houses.
If you'd managed to save money over the years, this could be a viable path. You'd provide rooms and basic services to lodgers, working for yourself rather than for an employer. It was still hard work, but you had more autonomy.
But many servants hadn't been able to save enough. After a lifetime of low wages, after sending money home to family or spending what little you earned on basic necessities, you might reach your 50s or 60s with almost nothing. And at that point, your options were grim. Some ended up dependent on family, moving in with children or siblings who could barely afford to support them. Some relied on charity, on churches or charitable organizations that provided minimal support to the elderly poor. And some ended up in workhouses, the dreaded institutions we discussed earlier, spending their final years in the same grim poverty they'd spent their lives trying to avoid. It's a bitter irony. You could spend your entire life working hard, being responsible, doing everything right, and still end up destitute. The system didn't reward virtue or effort. It used people up and discarded them. There were some organizations that tried to help retired servants. Servant benevolence societies collected small contributions from working servants and used the funds to help those who'd fallen on hard times. Some employers established small pensions for long-serving staff, but these efforts were drops in the bucket compared to the scale of the problem. The lack of a social safety net meant that your entire security depended on your ability to keep working. Stop working for any reason, and you were in immediate trouble. This created enormous anxiety and pressure. Servants would work through illness and injury, hiding problems as long as possible, because admitting you couldn't work was admitting you were finished. Let's drift over to the topic of servants and crime, because this is an interesting window into both the desperation of their circumstances and the prejudices of Victorian society. Servants were frequently accused of theft, and some of those accusations were justified. When you were desperate, when you were being paid almost nothing while surrounded by wealth, the temptation to take things must have been significant.
Small-scale theft was probably quite common. A bit of food from the pantry, a candle, some small item that wouldn't be immediately missed. Most servants probably didn't think of this as real theft. The family had so much, surely they wouldn't miss a little, and you needed it more than they did. More serious theft, actual stealing of money or valuable items, was rarer, but it happened. A housemaid might steal jewelry or silver, hoping to pawn it for money that could change her life. Usually these thefts were discovered, and the consequences were severe. You'd be dismissed, prosecuted, possibly sent to prison. Your life as a respectable servant was over. But here's the thing. Servants were also frequently falsely accused of theft. An item would go missing, and the immediate assumption was that a servant had taken it. Often the item had simply been misplaced, or another family member had moved it, or it had never existed in the form the accuser remembered. But the servant would be blamed, searched, sometimes dismissed, all without any real evidence. The power dynamic meant that an accusation was often enough. If the mistress said you'd stolen something, who was going to believe your denial? You were a servant. She was a lady. Your word meant nothing compared to hers. Some employers used accusations of theft as a convenient way to get rid of servants they didn't like. Rather than dismiss someone without cause and have to provide a reference, they'd accuse the servant of theft, dismiss her without a reference, and the servant's career was destroyed. It was cruel and unjust, but it happened. On the flip side, servants were also sometimes victims of crime. Working in a household gave criminals information about the family's routines, possessions, and security. There were cases of servants being coerced or bribed into helping burglars, providing information or access. Most refused, but some, especially those who were desperate or resentful, cooperated.
And some servants were victims of violence or exploitation within the household, as we've discussed. Victorian society didn't really acknowledge this. The home was supposed to be a safe, moral space, and admitting that servants were being harmed in these homes would have contradicted that ideology. Let's talk about pregnancy and childbirth among servants in more depth, because this was such a critical and tragic aspect of many women's lives. We've touched on this, but it's worth exploring further. If you became pregnant while in service, your life was essentially over as you knew it. It didn't matter how it happened, whether it was assault or coercion or a consensual relationship. The result was the same. You'd be dismissed immediately once the pregnancy became apparent. Some women managed to hide pregnancies for months, wearing looser clothing, continuing to work even as it became increasingly difficult. They were hoping for, what? A miracle? Some way out that didn't exist? They were just delaying the inevitable. Once you were dismissed, you faced a cascading series of awful options. If you had family who would take you in despite the shame, you might go there to have the baby. But you'd be bringing disgrace on your family, and they might refuse to help. Victorian morality was harsh on unwed mothers, and that harshness extended to families rejecting their own daughters. If you had no family support, you might go to a lying-in hospital or a charitable home for unwed mothers. These institutions provided basic care during pregnancy and childbirth, but they came with heavy moral judgment. You'd be lectured endlessly about your sin, required to attend religious services, treated as a fallen woman who needed to be reformed. After the birth, the baby would usually be taken for adoption or sent to an orphanage. You'd be encouraged to give the child up, because how could a single woman with no means possibly care for a baby? Some women did keep their babies, but it meant a life of extreme poverty and hardship. You couldn't work as a live-in servant with a child, and other employment options for women with children were scarce and poorly paid. Some women, faced with these impossible options, chose desperate measures. Infanticide was not uncommon among servants and other working-class women. A newborn might be abandoned or killed, the mother hoping to hide the birth and return to her life. Victorian newspapers regularly reported on such cases, always with horror and moral condemnation, never with any understanding of the desperation that led to such acts. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, but some women sought it out anyway. There were practitioners, often called baby farmers or wise women, who provided abortions with herbs, instruments, or other methods. These procedures were unsafe, often ineffective, and sometimes fatal. But for a desperate woman who saw no other way out, it might seem worth the risk. The mortality rate for women and babies in these circumstances was high. Childbirth itself was dangerous in an era before modern medicine. Add in poverty, stress, poor nutrition, lack of proper care, and the risks multiplied. Some women died in childbirth. Some died from botched abortions. Some died by suicide, seeing no way forward. And through all of this, the men involved faced no consequences. If a servant became pregnant by an employer, his son, or another servant, he could simply deny it or claim she'd seduced him. Society would believe him over her. He'd go on with his life while hers was destroyed. The sheer injustice of it is staggering. A young woman, often barely more than a girl, would have her entire life derailed by a pregnancy.
She'd lose her job, her reputation, her future prospects, possibly her family, possibly her life. Meanwhile, the man involved would face nothing worse than maybe some gossip, and even that was unlikely.
Some reform organizations did try to address this. There were homes that allowed unwed mothers to keep their babies, provided training for other work, and tried to help them build new lives. But these were few, and they could only help a small fraction of the women who needed it. Let's shift to something slightly less dark, the rare success stories. Because not every housemaid's life ended in poverty or tragedy. Some did manage to improve their circumstances, though the paths to doing so were narrow and required luck as much as effort. Marriage was the most common way out of service. If you married, you'd leave your position and become a wife, which came with its own challenges, but at least offered the possibility of a different life. But marriage required finding someone willing to marry you, and your options as a servant were limited. You had almost no opportunity to meet potential husbands. Your time off was minimal. Your social circle was tiny. Most servants who married ended up marrying other servants or working-class men from their home villages. These marriages often meant trading one form of hard work for another. You'd stop being a servant and become a laborer's wife, managing a household on very little money, possibly taking in washing or other work to help make ends meet. But some servants married relatively well. A housemaid might catch the eye of a tradesman or shopkeeper, someone with a bit more income and security. This could genuinely improve her circumstances. She'd have her own household, more autonomy, a better standard of living. These were the happy endings, relatively speaking. Very occasionally, a servant married significantly above her station. A pretty lady's maid might marry a gentleman, or a charming housemaid might catch a wealthy man's interest. These stories were rare, almost scandalous, and widely gossiped about. They were also often unhappy. The class difference created problems. The woman was never accepted by her husband's social circle, and the marriage might be rocky.
But they made for good stories, and they fed the fantasy that a servant might someday rise above her circumstances through romance. It was the Victorian version of a fairy tale, and about as realistic. Another path upward was through long, patient advancement within service. A clever, hard-working housemaid might, over many years, work her way up to housekeeper in a large household. This was a position of real responsibility and relatively good pay. A housekeeper in a grand estate earned significantly more than a housemaid, had her own comfortable room, ate better food, and was treated with respect. But getting there required decades of perfect service, good references from multiple positions, the right opportunities opening up at the right times, and a good bit of luck. Most housemaids never made it that far. Some servants used their positions as stepping stones to other opportunities. If you worked in a household and learned skills like cooking, sewing, or household management, you might eventually leave service and set up your own small business. A cook might open a bakery or tea shop. A skilled seamstress might take in sewing work. A woman with organizational skills might run a boarding house. These ventures required capital, which meant saving for years from your minimal wages. It also required business sense, which servants weren't generally expected to have or develop. But some managed it, creating independent lives for themselves outside the rigid hierarchy of service. Education was another rare but possible path. Some servants taught themselves to read and write well, educated themselves in their limited spare time, and eventually found positions as governesses or school teachers. This required exceptional dedication and intelligence, and opportunities were limited, but it did happen.
There are a few documented cases of servants who became writers, documenting their experiences or writing novels. These women were remarkable exceptions, but they show that the inner lives of servants were as rich and complex as anyone else's, even if society refused to acknowledge it. And then there were the servants who emigrated. For some, leaving Britain entirely was the path to a better life. Canada, Australia, the United States all offered opportunities that didn't exist at home. Emigration was risky and expensive, and it meant leaving everything you knew and everyone you knew. But for some servants, it was worth it. Emigration schemes sometimes specifically recruited domestic servants, offering passage and placement in households abroad. The work might be similar, but wages were often better, and the rigid class system was sometimes less entrenched in these newer societies. A servant in America or Australia might have more mobility, more opportunity to save money and change her circumstances. But emigration also meant isolation, being in a foreign place with no support network, possibly facing prejudice or exploitation. It was a gamble, and not everyone who took it found the better life they hoped for. Let's talk about the cultural representation of servants, because the way they were portrayed in Victorian literature, theater, and later media tells us a lot about how they were perceived. In popular fiction, servants were usually minor characters, comic relief, or moral exemplars. The good servant was faithful, loyal, maybe a bit simple, but honest and hard-working. Think of characters who served their employers for decades, who'd never dream of questioning their place, who found fulfillment in service. These characters reinforce the idea that service was a noble calling and that good servants were happy in their work. It was comforting propaganda for the upper classes, assuring them that their servants weren't suffering or resentful. The bad servant was lazy, dishonest, possibly scheming. She'd steal, lie, neglect her duties. She'd be punished in the narrative, dismissed or otherwise facing consequences for her moral failings. These characters served as warnings about the dangers of hiring the wrong sort of person. What you rarely saw in Victorian literature were servants depicted as complex, fully realized human beings with their own desires, dreams, and inner lives. They were types, not individuals. They served plot functions, but weren't subjects of their own stories. There were exceptions. Some Victorian writers, particularly later in the era, did explore servants' experiences with more depth. Charles Dickens, though he had problematic views on class, did sometimes give servants more complexity. Some women writers, possibly drawing on their own observations, portrayed servants with more empathy. But overall, the cultural representation reinforced the class system. Servants were there to serve. Their stories mattered insofar as they intersected with the stories of their betters. This cultural invisibility extended beyond fiction. Servants appear in photographs from the era, but usually in the background or in formal group portraits of household staff.
Individual portraits of servants are rare because they couldn't afford to have photographs taken, and nobody thought their images were worth preserving. Written records are similarly sparse. Most servants left no letters, no diaries, no documentation of their lives. They were illiterate or semi-literate. They had no time for writing, and their lives weren't considered historically significant. What we know about servants' experiences comes mostly from the records of their employers, from court documents, from census records, from the occasional charitable organizations' reports. It's only in recent decades that historians have really tried to reconstruct servants' lives, to recover their voices and experiences. And even now, there are enormous gaps in our knowledge. Whole lives lived in silence, leaving almost no trace. Let's drift into the very end of the Victorian era and the beginning of the 20th century, when the system started to slowly change. The decline of domestic service didn't happen at once, but the seeds were planted in the late Victorian period. Rising wages in other sectors started to make service less attractive. Factory work, shop work, office work for women. These options paid better and offered more freedom. You'd have set hours, time off, more control over your own life. The work might be hard, but it was finite. You clocked in, did your job, and went home to your own space. Younger women, when they had choices, increasingly chose these options over service. Why would you become a housemaid, living under someone else's roof, on call all the time for minimal pay, when you could work in a shop and live in your own lodgings? Employers started to notice that it was getting harder to find good servants, or any servants at all. They had to offer better wages, better conditions to compete. Some households that had kept large staffs started reducing the number of servants they employed, making do with fewer.
World War I was a major turning point. With men away at war, women took on all sorts of work that had previously been closed to them. They worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, took on clerical and administrative roles. They earned decent money, had independence, and many had no interest in returning to service after the war. The war also changed social attitudes somewhat. Women who'd contributed to the war effort weren't as willing to accept subservient positions afterward. And the massive loss of life in the war meant that labor was scarcer, which gave workers more bargaining power. Through the 1920s and beyond, domestic service continued to decline. The grand houses started to close or reduce their staffs dramatically. Middle-class families who'd once employed several servants might make do with one or none, or hire help by the day rather than having live-in staff. Technology also played a role. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, electric irons, modern stoves. All of these inventions reduced the need for armies of servants to maintain a household. A woman with these appliances could manage household tasks that previously required multiple servants. The culture shifted too. The rigid class hierarchies of the Victorian era began to soften, not disappear. Britain still has class issues, but the absolute rigidity started to crack. The idea that some people were born to serve while others were born to be served became less universally accepted. By the mid-20th century, the kind of domestic service we've been describing was largely gone. There are still domestic workers, housekeepers, cleaners, nannies, but the live-in servant system with its rigid hierarchies and terrible conditions has mostly disappeared from British life.
But the legacy lingers.
The grand houses remain, many of them open to tourists now. The period dramas we watch are set in this era, though they usually romanticize it beyond recognition. And in many parts of the world, domestic service systems similar to Victorian Britain's still exist, with many of the same power imbalances and exploitation. Let's talk about what we can learn from all of this, because it's not just historical curiosity. The Victorian housemaid's experience tells us things about power, class, exploitation, and human resilience that remain relevant. It shows how easily humans can rationalize and normalize the suffering of others. The Victorian upper classes weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who'd been raised in a system that told them their comfort depended on others' service, and that this was natural and right. They could be kind to their servants while still fundamentally dehumanizing them, because the kindness was always from a position of absolute power. It shows how economic desperation creates vulnerability. The housemaids who accepted terrible wages and conditions did so because they had no better options. The system kept them desperate by design, because desperate people will accept things that people with choices won't. It shows the particular vulnerability of women in patriarchal systems. Housemaids faced exploitation as workers and as women, subject to both class and gender hierarchies that left them with virtually no power or protection. And it shows human resilience. Despite everything, these women lived their lives. They formed relationships, found moments of joy, survived against odds that seem almost impossible. They were strong in ways we rarely acknowledge.
The work they did was skilled and valuable. Managing a Victorian household required an enormous range of skills and knowledge. But because it was women's work, because it was servants' work, it was undervalued and underpaid. That dynamic still exists today in many fields, especially care work and domestic labor. The invisibility of servants in their own time has become a kind of historical invisibility. We know so much about the Victorian upper classes because they left records, wrote letters, sat for portraits, filled the historical record with their lives. Servants were deliberately excluded from that record, and recovering their stories now is difficult. But those stories matter. The grand sweep of history, the politics and wars and social movements, all of that was underpinned by the daily labor of ordinary people. The housemaid waking before dawn in the cold and dark, the aching knees, the cracked hands, the exhaustion, the small kindnesses and the casual cruelties, the lives lived in service to others, valuable but unvalued. Let your mind drift through these Victorian rooms, these basement kitchens and attic bedrooms, these lives that were hidden behind the elegant facades.
Hey, you're back. Or maybe you never left. Either way, welcome to the final stretch of our journey through the world of Victorian housemaids. We've covered so much ground, walked through so many cold mornings and endless tasks, but there's still more to explore. So settle in one last time, get as comfortable as you can, and let's drift through these final hours together. We've talked about the work, the hierarchy, the social dynamics, but let's get even more specific. Let's talk about the actual physical spaces that servants inhabited, because the geography of a Victorian house tells you everything about the social order. In a typical grand Victorian house, the servants' domain was carefully separated from the family's.
You'd have the front of the house, the public and family areas, with their elegant furnishings and natural light and comfortable temperatures. And then you'd have the back of the house, the servants' areas, which were a completely different world. The kitchen was usually in the basement or the back of the house, often below ground level. This meant working in a space with limited natural light, relying on lamps and candles even during the day. The windows, if there were any, were small and high up, at street level or below. You'd see people's feet walking past outside, but never their faces. Kitchens were hot, especially in summer. The coal or wood stove would be burning all day for cooking, heating water, warming irons. There was no air conditioning, limited ventilation. The heat was oppressive, and yet you'd be expected to work in there for hours, standing over boiling pots, bending over ovens, moving constantly. The scullery, where the rough washing up happened, was even worse. This was typically the dampest, darkest, least pleasant space in the house. The scullery maid, the lowest of the low in the servant hierarchy, spent her days in there washing dishes and pots in greasy water, scrubbing away at stubborn stains, her hands perpetually wrinkled and raw.
The servants' hall, where you ate meals and sometimes gathered in the evening, was a plain room with basic furniture. A long table with benches were simple chairs, maybe a fireplace if you were lucky. No decorations, no comfort. It was purely functional. Your bedroom, if you were a lower servant, was up in the attic. You'd climb narrow back staircases, sometimes several flights to reach these rooms. In older houses, the staircases were steep and dark, easy to trip on when you were exhausted. The attic rooms were small, often with sloped ceilings that meant you couldn't stand up straight except in the center, a tiny window, if any. The furnishings would be minimal, a narrow bed, maybe a small chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher. That was it. If you shared a room, which most lower servants did, you'd have even less space and privacy. These rooms were freezing in winter because heat rose from the family's rooms below but didn't make it all the way up to the attics. You'd pile on whatever blankets you had, maybe wear extra clothes to bed, and still wake up shivering. In summer, the attics were stifling, hot air trapped under the roof with no circulation. The walls were thin. You'd hear everything happening in adjacent rooms, and the servants in those rooms would hear you. Privacy was basically non-existent. Even in your own bed, in your supposed private time, you were never really alone. Upper servants had better rooms. A housekeeper or butler might have a sitting room as well as a bedroom, with better furnishings, more space, more comfort. These rooms might be on a lower floor, closer to the family's quarters. This physical proximity reflected their higher status.
The servants' areas were connected by a network of back hallways and staircases that were separate from the family's routes through the house. You'd move through these hidden passages, unseen, going about your work while the family moved through their elegant hallways and grand staircases in a completely separate circulation pattern. It was like two different buildings occupying the same space, two parallel worlds that occasionally intersected but remained fundamentally separate. The family might live their entire lives in that house and never actually see most of the servants' areas, and you might work there for years and never enter the best rooms, the drawing rooms and bedrooms and libraries that you cleaned but weren't allowed to linger in. Let's talk about clothing in more detail, because what you wore was another marker of your status and another source of discomfort and expense. Your uniform, as we mentioned, was typically provided by the employer, at least in theory. The reality was more complicated. Some employers provided complete uniforms, Others provided just the dresses, and you had to supply your own aprons, caps, and undergarments. Some provided nothing and expected you to supply your own uniform, which they deduct from your wages. The uniform had to be maintained in perfect condition. You were responsible for washing, mending, and ironing your own uniform, which you had to do in your almost non-existent spare time. If your uniform became too worn or damaged, you might have to pay for repairs or replacement yourself. You'd typically have 2 or 3 sets of work clothes, so you could rotate them for washing. A morning uniform in drab colors for the dirty work, an afternoon uniform in black and white if you might be seen, and maybe a better dress for Sundays or special occasions.
Under the dress, you'd wear a chemise, drawers, a corset, and petticoats. Yes, even servants wore corsets, though theirs were simpler and less restrictive than what upper-class women wore. But you were still corseted while doing hard physical labor, which was uncomfortable and restrictive. Your shoes were your own responsibility and expense. A pair of sturdy boots or shoes cost money that you barely had, but you needed them because you were on your feet all day, every day. Your shoes would wear out quickly, the soles would develop holes, and you'd have to save up to replace them or make do with broken shoes that hurt your feet. Stockings were another expense. They'd develop holes and need to be darned constantly. In winter, you needed warmer stockings, but they cost more. Many servants simply went without adequate stockings and suffered with cold, aching legs. Your outdoor clothing for your precious few hours off was minimal. Maybe a shawl, a bonnet, a cloak if you were lucky. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. You'd wear your Sunday dress, your best outfit, which was still very plain compared to what even a middle-class woman would wear. Laundry for your own clothes was done whenever you could fit it in, late at night or early morning, in whatever time you could steal. You'd wash things in cold water because you didn't have access to the hot water or the facilities during your work hours. Everything would be slightly grimy, slightly worn, never quite as clean or nice as you'd like. Your appearance was supposed to be neat and tidy at all times, hair completely covered by a cap, no loose strands, face clean, hands clean, even though you were constantly doing dirty work. You were supposed to be presentable, but not attractive. Looking too pretty was suspicious, suggesting vanity or worse. Some employers had specific rules about servants' appearances. No jewelry, except maybe a simple cross or locket. No bright colors. No fashion or adornment. You were supposed to be invisible, and your clothing reinforced that. Plain, dark, unremarkable. You faded into the background, which was the point. Let's drift over to the topic of personal possessions, because what little servants owned tells us a lot about their lives. You'd arrive at a position with basically nothing, maybe a small trunk or bag containing a few items of clothing, a Bible if you had one, maybe a letter from home or a small keepsake. That was it. Your entire life's possessions fit in a single bag. Over time, you might accumulate a few more things. A better pair of shoes saved up for over months, a nicer shawl, a book or two if you could read and if you could find or afford them, maybe some writing paper and envelopes for letters home. Some servants collected small treasures, a pretty ribbon given as a gift, a pressed flower, a postcard from a place you'd never been but dreamed about. These tiny things were precious because you had so little. Photographs, when they became more accessible later in the Victorian era, were treasured possessions.
A photograph of your family back home, or of fellow servants, or even of yourself was valuable. It was proof of connection, of identity, of existence beyond your role as a servant.
You might have sewing supplies, needles and thread and buttons, because you had to maintain your clothes, and you might do mending for extra pennies. A few personal items, soap, a comb, maybe a little mirror. The basics of existence. If you were saving money, you'd keep it hidden in your trunk or somewhere safe. There were no banks for people like you, no safe deposit boxes. Your savings, whatever pittance you'd managed to accumulate, had to be kept on your person or in your room, vulnerable to theft or loss. Some servants kept diaries or wrote letters regularly, and these papers would be among their most precious possessions. The ability to record your thoughts, to communicate with loved ones, was valuable beyond measure. The paper itself cost money, and time to write was scarce, so every letter or diary entry represented a significant investment. Religious items were common: a Bible, a prayer book, a rosary if you were Catholic. Religion was important in Victorian life, and for servants who had so little control over their circumstances, faith offered comfort and hope. These items were often among the few possessions someone kept their entire life. When a servant died, their possessions would be gathered up and sent to family if they had any, or sold to pay for burial if they didn't. An entire life reduced to a small bundle of worn clothes and a few personal items. It's sobering to think about. Let's talk about illness and death, because these were ever-present realities in Victorian life, and servants were particularly vulnerable.
Illness was a disaster. If you got sick, really sick, you couldn't work. And if you couldn't work, you were a burden. Some employers were kind and would care for sick servants, call a doctor, allow them to rest and recover. But many would dismiss a sick servant, sending her away to fend for herself, or dumping her on family, or in a hospital if she was too ill to move. Hospitals in the Victorian era were grim places, especially for the poor. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and often more dangerous than staying home. Many people went to hospital to die rather than to recover. Servants who ended up hospitalized were often there because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. Contagious diseases were a constant threat: tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, influenza, scarlet fever. Living in close quarters with other servants, working in damp conditions, being poorly nourished and exhausted, all of this made servants vulnerable to disease. And once one person in the servants' quarters got sick, it could spread quickly through the whole staff. Some households would quarantine sick servants, keeping them isolated to prevent spread. This meant being alone in your attic room, possibly with minimal care, hoping you'd recover. Other households would simply dismiss the sick person immediately, sending them out into the street to avoid the risk of contagion. Death was common enough that everyone had experience with it. You'd lose fellow servants to disease, accidents, or exhaustion. You'd receive word that family members back home had died. Death was a constant presence, not shocking or unusual, just part of life. When a servant died, if they died while in service, the employer would typically arrange for burial. This might be a simple affair in a common grave, or slightly better if the employer was generous, or if the servant had been with the family a long time. Some households had family plots where long-serving, faithful servants would be buried, which was considered a great honor.
Mourning rituals were elaborate in Victorian society, but they were mainly for the upper classes. Servants might observe mourning for deceased family members with a black armband or black clothes,
but they couldn't afford the elaborate mourning costumes and extended periods of grief that wealthier people practiced. When a member of the household died, servants would be involved in all the practical aspects, laying out the body, covering mirrors, stopping clocks, all the Victorian mourning rituals. You'd work during the funeral and the wake, serving guests, managing the household. Your own grief, if you'd cared for the deceased, had to be subordinate to your duties. Let's talk about the rare moments of leisure and entertainment that servants experienced, because it wasn't all misery all the time. There were small pleasures, brief escapes from the grind. On your half-day off, if the weather was nice, you might go for a walk. Just being outside, in fresh air, seeing something other than the inside of the house was a pleasure. You might walk in a park, or along streets, or out into the countryside if you were in a rural area. This cost nothing and gave you a sense of freedom. Some servants would use their time off to visit shops, not to buy much because they had no money, but just to look, to window shop, to imagine. You might buy a small treat if you had a few pennies, something special to eat, or a small ribbon or trinket. If you had friends in service in other nearby households, you might arrange to meet up during your time off. You'd sit in a park or a tea shop if you could afford it, and talk. Share gossip about your employers, complain about your work, exchange information about positions and wages. These friendships were vital, connections to people who understood your life.
Some servants attended lectures or educational events, particularly if they were interested in self-improvement. There were organizations that offered free or cheap lectures on various topics, religious groups that held social events, libraries where you could borrow books. For servants who were intellectually curious, these were precious opportunities. Music was important for many servants. If you could sing, you might join a church choir. Some households allowed servants to sing while they worked, or in the evenings in the servants' hall. Folk songs, hymns, popular songs of the day. Singing was free, required no equipment, and provided emotional release and enjoyment. If you played an instrument, which was rare for servants but not impossible, you might be allowed to bring a simple instrument like a tin whistle or harmonica. In the evenings, in the brief time before bed, there might be music and singing in the servants' hall. These moments of communal enjoyment were bright spots in otherwise hard lives. Reading, for those who could, was a major form of entertainment. Cheap novels, newspapers, magazines, religious tracts, anything you could get your hands on. Some servants read voraciously, consuming any text available. The act of reading was an escape, a way to experience other worlds and other lives while you were trapped in your own limited circumstances. Letter writing and receiving was both entertainment and connection. Writing a letter home, describing your life, asking about family, was a way to maintain ties to the world you'd left. Receiving a letter was an event, something to look forward to read and reread, to cherish. Some servants kept up with current events and politics, reading newspapers when they could get them, discussing what was happening in the world. The fact that they had no political power didn't mean they weren't interested or didn't have opinions. Holidays were anticipated for any special food or slight reduction in work they might bring. Even if you were working on Christmas Day, there might be a better meal, maybe a small gift, or a few hours of relative peace.
These small variations in the routine were significant. Let's talk about the specific hours of a housemaid's day in even more detail, because walking through an actual day, hour by hour, really drives home the relentlessness of it. 5 a.m., or possibly earlier, you wake in your freezing attic room. It's dark outside, dark in the room. You get out of bed, feeling the cold immediately. You wash your face with cold water from the pitcher on your washstand. Dress quickly in the dark or by the light of a single candle. You put on your morning uniform. Make sure your hair is pinned up and covered with your cap. 5:15 a.m. You're downstairs, gathering the supplies you need for the morning work. Buckets, brushes, cloths, coal scuttle, matches. Your hands are already cold and stiff. 6:30 a.m. You start on the fireplaces, going from room to room on the family floors as quietly as possible. You kneel in front of each fireplace, scoop out yesterday's ashes into your bucket, trying not to raise dust. Clean the grate, lay a new fire with paper, kindling, coal. Light it carefully, making sure it catches. Move to the next room. Repeat. 6:30 a.m. Fireplace is done. Now you're outside in the early morning, possibly still dark, scrubbing the front steps. Cold water, harsh soap, a brush, and your aching knees on stone. Scrub until the steps are pristine. Stand up, knees screaming, back aching. Rinse. Empty the bucket. Some employers had specific rules about servants' appearances. No jewelry, except maybe a simple cross or locket. No bright colors. No fashion or adornment. You were supposed to be invisible, and your clothing reinforced that. Plain, dark, unremarkable. You faded into the background, which was the point. Let's drift over to the topic of personal possessions, because what little servants owned tells us a lot about their lives. You'd arrive at a position with basically nothing, maybe a small trunk or bag containing a few items of clothing, a Bible if you had one, maybe a letter from home or a small keepsake. That was it. Your entire life's possessions fit in a single bag. Over time, you might accumulate a few more things. A better pair of shoes saved up for over months, a nicer shawl, a book or two if you could read and if you could find or afford them. Maybe some writing paper and envelopes for letters home. Some servants collected small treasures, a pretty ribbon given as a gift, a pressed flower, a postcard from a place you'd never been but dreamed about. These tiny things were precious because you had so little. Photographs, when they became more accessible later in the Victorian era, were treasured possessions. A photograph of your family back home, or of fellow servants, or even of yourself was valuable. It was proof of connection, of identity, of existence beyond your role as a servant.
11 a.m. Still cleaning. Maybe you're doing laundry now, if it's a laundry day. Hauling water, heating it, beginning the washing process. Or maybe you're helping in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for lunch, washing up from breakfast. 12 p.m. Lunch for the family, which means work for you. Serving, if that's your role, or continuing with your other tasks. You might grab something to eat yourself, another quick meal of bread and tea, maybe some leftovers if there are any. 1 p.m. Afternoon tasks. Maybe you're ironing now, pressing the laundry from yesterday, or you're cleaning more rooms because there are always more rooms, or you're running errands, going to shops, carrying parcels. 2 p.m. If you're lucky and the household is generous, you might get a brief rest around now, a cup of tea and 15 minutes sitting down. If not, you're still working, mending maybe, sitting in the servants' hall with a basket of items that need repair, stitching away. 3 p.m. The family might be having tea. You're preparing it, serving it, cleaning up after it. Or you're changing into your afternoon uniform if you're going to be visible, making yourself presentable. 4 p.m. More cleaning or preparing for dinner, setting the table if that's your job, making sure everything is perfect. Or you're helping with dinner preparations in the kitchen, an endless process for an elaborate Victorian dinner.
5 p.m. Dinner preparations intensifying. Running up and down stairs, fetching things, carrying things, helping wherever you're needed. The kitchen is hot and chaotic, everyone working at maximum speed. 6 or 7 p.m., dinner is served. If you're serving, you're in the dining room, bringing dishes, clearing plates, being perfectly invisible and efficient. If not, you're in the kitchen, washing up, cleaning, managing the chaos. 8 p.m., dinner is finally over. Now comes the massive cleanup. Mountains of dishes to wash, pots to scrub, the dining room to clean, everything to put away. This takes hours. Your hands are raw from hot water and harsh soap. Your feet are screaming. Your back aches. 9 or 10 p.m., still cleaning, getting the house ready for the next day, making sure everything is in order, that the fires are banked, that the family has everything they might need for the night. 10 or 11 p.m., finally, maybe you're done. You can go to your room. You're exhausted beyond words. You might do a bit of mending on your own clothes, or write a letter if you have the energy. More likely, you just collapse into bed. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all again, and the next day, and the next.
The sheer grinding repetitiveness of it is perhaps the worst part. It's not just that any individual day is hard, it's that every day is hard, in exactly the same ways, with no variation, no relief, no end in sight. Let's talk about specific examples, real people when we can find them in the historical record, because individual stories bring this to life in a way that generalizations can't. There's a woman named Hannah Culwick, who we know about because she kept a diary and because she had a very unusual life. She was a housemaid in the mid-Victorian period, and she documented her work in detail. She described days that started at 5 a.m. and ended at midnight. She wrote about scrubbing floors until her hands bled, about hauling coal, about the physical toll of the work. Hannah was also involved in a secret relationship with a middle-class man named Arthur Mumby, who had a fascination with working women. They eventually married, which was scandalous, but they kept the marriage secret for years. Hannah's diaries give us an incredible window into a servant's life, her thoughts, her experiences, her perspective. Another documented case is that of a young woman named Elizabeth Evans, who appeared in court records after being accused of stealing from her employer. The trial documents revealed that she'd been working 17-hour days, was given inadequate food, and was paid irregularly. She'd taken some food because she was literally starving.
The court convicted her anyway, and she was sent to prison. These cases, when we can find them, reveal the human reality behind the statistics. Each of these women was a person with hopes and feelings and desires. Hannah wanted to be valued for her work. Elizabeth wanted to not be hungry. Simple, basic human needs that the system frequently failed to meet.
There are records of servants who died young from overwork or disease. A scullery maid named Mary Ann Wilson, who died at age 16 from exhaustion and malnutrition. A housemaid named Sarah Jane, who fell down the servants' stairs carrying a heavy load and broke her neck. Each of these was a life cut short, a person reduced to a footnote in someone else's household accounts. And there are the rare success stories. A housemaid named Margaret Macmillan, who educated herself, became a socialist activist, and spent her life advocating for children's health and education. A servant named Harriet Beecher, who saved enough money to emigrate to America and opened her own boarding house. These women were exceptional, but they show what was possible with extraordinary determination and luck. Let's talk about the sensory experience of being a servant, because the physical sensations were a constant presence. The smell of coal smoke and ash in your clothes, in your hair, in your lungs. The smell of lye soap and harsh cleaning chemicals, acrid and burning. The smell of cooking food that you prepared but might not get to eat. The smell of chamber pots and human waste that you had to deal with every day. The smell of damp wool when your clothes got wet and didn't fully dry. The smell of your own sweat after hours of hard work in hot conditions. The smell of the cramped servants' quarters, too many people in too small a space with inadequate ventilation. The sounds, the scrubbing brush against stone, the swoosh of a broom on carpet, the clatter of dishes being washed, the crackle of coal fires, the bell system in grander houses, different bells for different rooms, and you had to learn which sound meant which room was calling. The sound of footsteps above you, the family moving through their house while you moved through yours below.
The feel of cold water on already raw hands. The weight of buckets of water or coal pulling on your arms and shoulders. The hardness of stone floors against your knees. The heat of the kitchen in summer, the cold of the attic in winter. The texture of the fabrics you cleaned and ironed, fine silks and linens that you'd never wear yourself. The taste of simple food, bread and tea consumed quickly, never quite enough. The metallic taste of exhaustion in your mouth at the end of a long day. The rare treat of something sweet or rich, a taste of the life lived by the people above you. These sensory experiences were your constant companions, more immediate and real than any abstract ideas about class or society or your place in the world. Let's drift into the topic of religion and spirituality in servants' lives, because this was significant for many. The Victorian era was deeply religious, at least publicly. Christianity, specifically Anglicanism in England, was woven through all aspects of life. For servants, religion offered several things. First, comfort and hope. If your present life was hard, the promise of a better afterlife was sustaining. The Bible's messages about the meek inheriting the earth, about the difficulty of a rich man entering heaven, about God's care for sparrows and lilies. These resonated with people who had so little.
Second, community. Church was one of the few places where you could interact with people outside your immediate household. You'd see other servants, possibly people from your home village, acquaintances from previous positions. The religious social network was real and valuable. Third, structure and meaning. Religious observance gave shape to the week and the year. Sundays were different because of church. Christmas and Easter was significant. Religious festivals marked time in a life that might otherwise blur into endless sameness. Many servants were genuinely devout, finding real spiritual sustenance in their faith. They'd pray daily, read their Bibles in spare moments, attend church faithfully. Their faith wasn't just social convention, it was a genuine source of strength. But religion also reinforced the class system. Sermons often emphasized accepting your lot in life, being content with your station, serving your masters faithfully as you served God. The message was frequently that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, so you should endure without complaint. Some servants internalized this completely, seeing their service as a religious calling, their suffering as spiritually valuable. Others were more skeptical, attending church because it was expected, but not necessarily believing all the messages they heard. There were also servants who lost their faith, who couldn't reconcile a loving God with the suffering and injustice they experienced. For some, the crisis of faith was profound, leaving them without the comfort religion had previously provided.
Different denominations appealed to different people. Methodism and other nonconformist churches were popular among working-class people because they were often more egalitarian, less tied to the class system. Catholic servants, especially Irish immigrants, faced additional prejudice but found community in their churches. Some employers tried to control their servants' religious practice, requiring attendance at the family's church, forbidding certain denominations. This was another way of exerting control, but it also sometimes backfired, creating resentment. Let's talk about folklore, superstitions, and the beliefs that existed alongside or instead of formal religion. Many servants, especially those from rural backgrounds, brought folk beliefs with them into service. Beliefs about luck, about omens, about ways to protect yourself from misfortune. These beliefs were often dismissed by the educated upper classes as ignorant superstitions, but for servants they were meaningful. There were superstitions around household tasks. You weren't supposed to sweep dust out the front door because you'd sweep away the household's luck. You should always put on your right shoe before your left. Breaking a mirror brought 7 years bad luck, which was terrifying when your job involved handling your employer's valuable mirrors. There were beliefs about dreams, about signs and portents. A bird hitting a window meant death was coming. Seeing a single magpie was unlucky unless you greeted it properly. These might seem silly, but they were ways of making sense of a world where you had very little control. Some servants believed in ghosts, especially in old houses with long histories. There are accounts of servants refusing to go into certain rooms alone, convinced they were haunted. Some claimed to have seen or heard spirits. Whether these were genuine supernatural experiences, tricks of light and sound in old buildings, or psychological responses to stress and fear, they were real to the people experiencing them. Folk remedies for illness were common.
Servants couldn't afford doctors, so they relied on traditional treatments. Herbs and poultices for wounds, specific foods for specific ailments, charms and prayers for protection. Some of these remedies had genuine medicinal value, others were purely placebo, but they gave people a sense of agency, of being able to do something about their situation. There were also beliefs and practices around love and marriage, fortune-telling, reading tea leaves or palms, trying to divine who you'd marry or what your future held. These were entertainments, but also genuine attempts to peek into a future that was otherwise completely uncertain. Magic and witchcraft were less openly discussed, but still present in some communities. A servant who fell ill might suspect that she'd been cursed. Someone who'd had a run of bad luck might seek out a wise woman to lift a hex. The boundaries between religion, folk practice, and magic were often blurry. Let's talk about the daily interactions with people outside the household, because servants weren't completely isolated. Tradespeople came to the house regularly: the butcher, the baker, the milkman, the coal delivery man, the greengrocer. These interactions were often handled by the cook or housekeeper, but housemaids would encounter these people too.
These interactions were interesting because they were between working people, but the servants still represented their employers and had to maintain certain standards. You were negotiating deliveries, checking quality, making sure bills were correct. It required a different kind of skill than the subservient role you played with the family. Some servants developed friendships or flirtations with tradesmen. The delivery boy might be someone close to your own age and class. You'd chat briefly when he came to the door, maybe exchange jokes or compliments. These interactions were monitored and could get you in trouble if they seemed too familiar, but they happened anyway. The postman was another regular visitor, and receiving mail was always an event. A letter from home could make your entire week. The postman might know you by name, might pass on local gossip, might be a brief, friendly face in your day. If you ran errands for the household, you'd interact with shopkeepers. These interactions were more extensive. You'd have to communicate what was needed, inspect goods, negotiate prices sometimes, handle money. It required confidence and knowledge. Some shopkeepers were kind to servants, maybe giving an extra measure or being patient with someone who was clearly exhausted and overworked. Others were dismissive or tried to cheat them, knowing servants had little recourse. Street vendors were another point of contact. In cities, there were people selling everything from flowers to food to household goods on the streets. On your rare time off, you might buy something from them or just enjoy the lively street scene.
The police were people you hoped to avoid. Servants who were out after dark could be questioned, suspected of wrongdoing just for being where they shouldn't be. The authorities were not friendly to working-class women, and many servants were wary of anyone in a position of official power. Let's talk about the very end of a servant's career, the transition out of service when it finally came. For women who married, leaving service was often abrupt. You'd give notice, work until your wedding day, and then you were gone, starting a new life as a wife, which had its own challenges, but was at least different. The household would replace you quickly, probably with another young woman equally desperate for work. You'd be forgotten almost immediately. The room you'd slept in would be someone else's. The tasks you'd done would be done by other hands. Your presence would leave no mark. For women who aged out of service without marrying, the transition was more gradual and more difficult. You'd find your work getting harder, your body less able to keep up. You might move to less demanding positions, from housemaid to charwoman, from live-in to day work. Eventually, you'd reach a point where you simply couldn't work anymore. Your knees wouldn't support scrubbing floors, your back couldn't take the lifting, your hands were too damaged to be useful. And then you were looking at the grim reality of old age with no resources. Some women ended up in almshouses, charitable housing for the elderly poor. These ranged from relatively decent to absolutely grim. You'd have a bed, basic food and shelter, but no comfort, no privacy, no dignity. Workhouses, as we've discussed, were the absolute last resort. Going into a workhouse meant admitting complete destitution. It meant giving up your independence, such as it was, and submitting to an institution designed to be harsh and punitive. Some former servants died alone in rented rooms, their bodies discovered only when the rent went unpaid. These deaths were noted briefly in local papers, if at all. Just another poor woman who'd worked her whole life and died with nothing. A very few, the ones who'd managed to save, who'd had lucky breaks, who'd found good positions with generous employers, might have a slightly more comfortable old age. A small pension, a room in a relative's house, enough to scrape by without destitution. But for the vast majority, the end of a life in service was bleak. All those years of hard work led to nothing much. No comfort, no security, no reward. Just an exhausted body and an uncertain future until death finally came as a release. Let's talk about legacy and memory, because what happened to the memory of these women after they died?
Most left no trace, no gravestone with their name, buried in common graves or paupers' fields. No written records beyond occasional mentions in household accounts or census records. No photographs, no letters preserved, no diaries. They lived and died and were forgotten. The grand houses they worked in still stand, many of them. Tourists visit them now, admire the architecture and furnishings, learn about the families who lived there. The servants who made that life possible are barely mentioned, footnotes if they appear at all. It's only relatively recently that historians have tried to recover these stories, to piece together what life was actually like for the millions of women who worked as servants. And even now, with all our research methods and resources, huge gaps remain. We can reconstruct the general patterns, the daily schedules, the wages and working conditions, but the individual lived experiences, the specific hopes and fears and joys and sorrows of particular women, most of that is lost forever. The few servants who left written records, who are known to us by name, have become representatives of millions who remain anonymous. Hannah Culwick's diary tells us something about what many servants experienced, but she was unusual in being able to write about it. What about all the women who couldn't write, whose stories never got told? There's something profound about this historical silence. These women were essential to their society, absolutely vital to the functioning of upper and middle class life. But they were considered so unimportant that their experiences weren't worth recording.
It tells us something about whose stories we value, whose lives we consider historically significant,
and it challenges us to think about who in our own time is doing essential work without recognition, whose stories aren't being told, who's being rendered invisible. The Victorian housemaid's life was hard in ways that are almost incomprehensible to us now. The physical labor, the social degradation, the powerlessness, the sheer relentless grinding monotony of it. And yet these were real people who lived these lives, who got up every morning and did what they had to do. They weren't saints or heroes. They were ordinary people dealing with extraordinary circumstances. Some were kind, some were mean. Some were smart, some were simple. Some were cheerful, some were bitter. They were human in all the complexity that implies. They deserved to be remembered, not as types or statistics, but as individuals who lived and worked and struggled. They built the world we inherited, even though they did it invisibly, scrubbing floors before dawn in houses that weren't theirs. So let's end with a moment of acknowledgement. For every Victorian housemaid whose name we'll never know, whose face we'll never see, whose story was never told. For the girl who left home at 13 to scrub strangers' floors. For the woman whose hands were destroyed by harsh soap and cold water. For the one who died young from exhaustion or disease. For the one who survived to old age with nothing to show for a lifetime of work. They mattered. Their work mattered. Their lives mattered, even though their society told them otherwise. And in remembering them, however imperfectly, we're saying that every life has value, that every person's experience is worth acknowledging, that the invisible work that makes society function deserves to be seen. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago. The specific system of domestic service we've been discussing is mostly gone, at least in Britain. But the dynamics we've explored, power and class and exploitation and invisible labor, those are still with us in different forms. So maybe in learning about these housemaids, in sitting with the reality of their lives, we're also learning something about our own world, about who does the essential work and how we value or don't value it, about power and who has it, about the human capacity to endure and to resist and to find moments of joy even in hard circumstances. That's it. That's the story of the Victorian housemaid, as much as we can tell it. A life lived in service to others, in the shadows, doing endless necessary work for minimal reward. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't glamorous. It was just hard, day after day, year after year. So now, let it all drift away. The cold attic rooms, the endless staircases, the fireplaces full of ash, the buckets of freezing water, the harsh soap, the aching knees, all of it. Let it fade into the past, where it belongs. Think about your own bed, warm and comfortable. Your own space, however small, that's yours. The choices you have, the autonomy, the options, the things we take for granted that would have seemed like impossible luxuries to a Victorian housemaid. Feel grateful for washing machines and central heating and reasonable working hours and minimum wage laws and all the small and large improvements that make life easier than it was. And maybe spare a thought for the people in our own time who are still doing invisible, undervalued work. The cleaners and care workers and all the others who keep things running while being largely unseen. But mostly, just rest now. Let your mind settle.
You've been on a long journey through a hard world. It's time to drift off into sleep, into dreams, into rest. The Victorian housemaids worked endless hours. You don't have to. You can just close your eyes and sleep. So sleep well, dream peacefully, and when you wake up, you'll be in a different world than the one we've been exploring. A better world, however imperfect it might be. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for listening to this very long story about lives that deserved to be remembered. The end.